Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure and honor, and I'm delighted to be involved in this inaugural event, and I hope that the festival continues for many years to come. And as Granny mentioned, I have come from a celebration of Le Fanu's kind of Irish Gothic ancestor, Charles Maturin, in Marsh's Library in Dublin yesterday. And as John noted earlier with regard to Le Fanu's home in Lower Dominic Street, the kind of material traces of Maturin's life in Dublin have also been erased, as has much of the Huguenot history of Dublin. And this cultural erasure is something that I'm really fascinated by, and it's always kind of seemed to me a huge shame. Not least because several of the works that we now specifically associate with Irish Gothic literature, by Le Fanu and Maturin in particular, continue to be reprinted today, continue to be read by a general reading public, and continue to be taught in universities around the world. And so I'm really interested in that idea of cultural legacy and why we don't remember Le Fanu and Maturin more, okay? And that's kind of what I'm talking about today. And I'm going to start with a kind of a recent adaptation of Carmilla, a Canadian YouTube, a hit YouTube series called Carmilla, which aired between 2014 and 2016, 3 seasons, and culminating in a film version, very short episodes, 5 minutes long. I'd recommend it. It's actually quite a good adaptation. And in season 1 of that series, the young and impressionable Laura arrives at Silas University in Austria with dreams of becoming a journalist. And she soon realizes that her investigative skills will have to be put to work on more than just her college assignments when her roommate suddenly and mysteriously disappears. Only to be replaced by this sexy new goth girl who wears only black and sleeps all day and eats Dracula-themed cereal with red soy milk on it. And setting out to uncover the truth, recording everything in her vlog, which is what we as viewers are supposed to be watching, Laura discovers that her substitute roomie, Carmilla, is, as she memorably puts it, an honest to Lestat vampire. And in fact, Carmilla is a 21st century incarnation of the famous vampire of the same name created by Irish Victorian writer Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. And the YouTube series is both a radical adaptation of the original source text, which was first serialized in the London magazine Dark Blue between 1871 and 1872, and then later published in the collection In a Glass Darkly in 1872. And a reimagination of it, one that asks what would happen if Le Fanu's Carmilla continued to prey upon unsuspecting teenage girls in the 21st century. Now, the series was created by Jordan Hall, Steph Wachnine, and Jay Bennett, and it was financed, I think rather hilariously, by the menstrual product brand Eucotex. The series really is very clever. A kind of 19th century vampire novel meets Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and its appearance in Canada less than a decade ago speaks to the continued cultural influence of Le Fanu's notorious novella. Indeed, Carmilla has been the subject of countless adaptations since its publication, including no fewer than 15 cinematic treatments, many of them radical rather than literal or traditional adaptations, and all of them pointing to the ways in which, as Nancy M. West observes, and I'm quoting here, Le Fanu's story has become something of a cult object over the years. From Carl Dreyer's Vampire in 1931, which asserted in its opening credits that it was taken from Sheridan Le Fanu's In a Glass Darkly, to the Salacious Hammer production, The Vampire Lovers in 1970, and the much more recent comedic reworking Lesbian Vampire Killers in 2009, Le Fanu's novella has been regularly and systematically revived and revised over the years. It's also been the object of numerous reprintings and new popular and critical editions, which I think Claire will be talking about Uncle Silas later, but like Uncle Silas, it has been the subject of many reprintings over the years. And it's been translated into several European languages, including French, Spanish, and German, as we might expect, but also Catalan, Turkish, and Swedish, sometimes on multiple occasions. So in this sense, Le Fanu's Carmilla has clearly entered what Pascal Casanova calls the World Republic of letters. In other words, it possesses literary capital. And Casanova defines literary capital, I'm sorry that's so small, literary capital as the power and authority granted to a writer by virtue of the belief that he's earned his name. Okay? And Casanova describes the World Republic of letters as basically like a battleground, authors fighting it out to make a name for themselves. But exactly why Carmilla has achieved literary capital is a little unclear, I think. As Darla Killeen has pointed out, the tale was initially dismissed by critics as, quote, a silly and miserable story, making it more than a little ironic, as Killeen further asserts, that it should be Carmilla that is now a standard presence on the multitude of courses dedicated to Gothic literature and is the one Le Fanu text many will ever come into contact with. Killeen further writes that it is with, and indeed in Carmilla, that Le Fanu's cultural afterlife is now completely tied up. The rest of Le Fanu's really kind of prolific literary production, with the notable exception of Uncle Silas, published in 1864, has been largely relegated to the margins of literary history, and Le Fanu himself frequently viewed as a kind of minor cultural figure. It would seem that Le Fanu, as an author, has failed to achieve the literary capital of his famous female vampire, an issue indirectly alluded to in Hall, Owaknine, and Bennett's adaptation. Explaining to Laura the history of her vampiric life, Carmilla begins with the story of falling in love with Elle in the series' most literal reference to its source text. And her narration of her story is hesitant, in part because she feels trapped in an endless repetition of the same story, of which she is always ever the only surviving witness. She says, "Posterity doesn't care. I should know. I live in it." And it's a really evocative line, and one that raises the question of legacy. Why do we, I mean, perhaps with the exception of the people in this room, why do we only ever remember Carmilla and maybe Uncle Silas when we talk about Le Fanu, in spite of a prolific publication record that includes no fewer than 20 novels, short story collections, and books of poetry, not to mention a lengthy list of uncollected magazine and newspaper contributions? What is it about Carmilla that makes it so appealing? Or perhaps more indicatively, what is it about Le Fanu's other works that make them comparatively less appealing? And the obvious answer is sex and the enduring fascination exerted by the vampire as a figure of cultural and allegorical significance. As Killeen argues, quote, Carmilla is remembered despite Le Fanu and not because of him. It enjoys the legacy that it does, largely because of its identification as the first lesbian vampire tale. But while Killeen's comments suggest that Carmilla has, in a sense, taken on a life of its own, the work has also been instrumental in propelling Le Fanu into a strangely anomalous position, at once a minor figure in Irish and Victorian literary histories, and a key member of the conventional tripartite configuration of the Irish Gothic, a body of literature traditionally associated with Le Fanu, Wilde, and Stoker. And perhaps ironically, it is precisely this association with a popular but also long derided literary form that has arguably maintained Le Fanu's marginal position. Le Fanu himself was keen to distance his works from what he called sensation fiction, and its close relative, the Gothic, though he was arguably the most well-known producer of periodical press Gothic in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. As a contributor to the Dublin University magazine from 1838 to 1869, Le Fanu published a significant body of Gothic tales, including, for instance, a passage in The Secret History of an Irish Countess, published in 1838, which was later reworked as or into Uncle Silas, The Fatal Bride in 1848, The Mysterious Lodger in 1850, Ghost Stories of Chapel Izod in 1851, and An Authentic Narrative of a Haunted House in 1862, just to name a few. Moreover, under his editor ownership between 1861 and 1869, the Dublin University magazine became an important venue for the publication of Gothic and sensation fiction, both Le Fanu's own and that of several budding sensation fiction writers, including Rhoda Broughton, even as it debated the relative worth of such fiction in terms that echo earlier 19th century discussions of high and low literature, of good and bad literature. And Le Fanu, for his part, eagerly presented his work as a literary offspring of Sir Walter Scott's historical novels. He asserted this position very clearly in the preliminary word that he appended to Uncle Silas. And in that preliminary word, he objected strenuously to the label of sensation fiction and encouraged his readers to understand his fiction in the much more respectable and respected terms of Scott's realist and historical modes. Sensation, Le Fanu wrote, is a degrading term, one that does injustice to a legitimate school of tragic English romance, which has been ennobled and in great measure founded by the genius of Sir Walter Scott. As Elizabeth Tilley has observed, Le Fanu, and I'm quoting here, believed that sensation as a driving force of fiction was coming to an end, and that only those authors whose works could claim a more than brief public interest could take their place beside great writers like Scott, and he wanted to be one of those writers. But neither this belief nor his comments in Uncle Silas could prevent that text's reception as a thoroughly Gothic one, as is suggested, I think, most clearly by Elizabeth Bowen's later assessment of it. Uncle Silas is a romance of terror, Bowen asserted in her introduction to the 1947 Cresset Press edition of the novel, before comparing Maud to the heroines of earlier Gothic romances, and drawing parallels between Le Fanu's novel and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which had been published in 1847. And Bowen's comments on Uncle Silas, as well as her subsequent claim that Uncle Silas is an Irish story transposed to an English setting, have profoundly shaped modern conceptualizations of Irish Gothic as linked emotionally and psychologically to Ireland and to Irish politics, even when not ostensibly about Ireland at all. And my interest here isn't really to offer a further investigation of Irish Gothic and conventional readings of it. Is it actually about Ireland or not? What I do want to focus on, though, is Le Fanu's association with popular fiction, and a literary form linked from the late 18th century to women writers and readers on the one hand, and to money on the other. And I'll deal with both of these, or each of these issues in turn, though as you'll see they're intrinsically connected. Because by the time Le Fanu began publishing his Gothic tales, the Gothic had long been associated with female writers and linked fundamentally to what's sometimes referred to as the quantitative versus qualitative rise of the novel in the closing decades of the 18th century and the beginning decades of the 19th. And it's in this period that literacy rates are rising and changes in print production make actually printing books much less expensive. And what happens is there's a kind of democratization of the literary world, which has suddenly opened up in unprecedented ways to, particularly to female readers and female writers. And not coincidentally, the Gothic comes into its own at the same time, with writers such as Anne Radcliffe, Isabella Kelly, and Regina Maria Roach, producing terrifying tales of haunted castles and beleaguered heroines that are understood by critics essentially to dumb down English literature, first by inspiring countless unskilled imitations, and second, by catering to the undiscriminating tastes of a naive female readership, interested only in escapism, as was immortalized by Jane Austen's lightly satirical Northanger Abbey in 1818, in which the heroine devotes herself to a lengthy list of quote-unquote horrid novels that convince her that she too is the subject of a Gothic romance. So the 1790s see this dramatic and unparalleled surge in female-authored fiction, and as several critics have noted, encourage in the early 1800s attempts by male authors such as Walter Scott and Charles Robert Maturin to reclaim and masculinize the novel. And this is why, for instance, having produced a number of decidedly Gothic works in the 1790s himself, including a collection of Gothic ballads in 1799, Walter Scott later very emphatically distanced himself from it, claiming to have been healed from the quote-unquote German measles. And German in this term, in this period, was essentially another word for Gothic. Writers in the late 18th and early 19th century weren't actually calling their works Gothic. They were using different terms. They were using terror, terrorist, German. The kind of application of the term Gothic novel comes much later. Okay, so Scott claims he'd been healed from his German measles, of his youth, and his particular association with the historical novel from the 1814 publication of his novel Waverley, or "'Tis 60 Years Since," is seen by critics both then and now as evidence of his commitment to masculine realism and historicism, rather than the kind of subliterary feminine Gothic romance. Now, obviously, in this context, Le Fanu's attempts to align himself with Scott are significant, not least because the sensation fiction of the mid-19th century is in important ways a continued development, I think, of the Gothic, of the Romantic period, and is like it both thoroughly feminized and in very many cases assigned to what Franco Moretti has memorably called the slaughterhouse of literature, right? The huge percentage of 19th century novels that we just don't talk about or know about anymore. And a case in point from the Romantic period is the Minerva Press, which is kind of my main focus at the moment. But the Minerva Press published a third of all new novels in the period from 1790 to 1820, many of them runaway Gothic bestsellers, but most of which are unread today. And Elizabeth Tilley suggests that Le Fanu basically was unable to distance himself effectively from this woman's genre of Gothic or sensation, and therefore shared a fate of obscurity with them. And reasons for this obscurity, beyond misogyny, basically, and the interests and anxieties of the 19th century male critical world, are multifactorial. But chief among them is the belief that the production of Gothic and sensation fiction was a form of hack writing that contravened 19th century norms of authorial originality and creativity, and which was driven fundamentally by money in the form of both market demands and authorial need. So to write Gothic or sensation fiction basically was to debase oneself, to not really be an author, but just to be a hack writer reproducing stock characters and themes and plots to appease readers who were themselves interested in reproducing the reading experience of previous Gothic or sensation fictions, and therefore for those authors to benefit from the gain of sale. And certainly Le Fanu was writing with an eye to money, particularly in the latter years of his life. Victor Sage comments that he was essentially desperate for money, and for the last 10 years of his life, he because he needed money, he rewrote all the earlier stories that he had written and presented them as new sensation novels for a predominantly English audience. Bill McCormick, the preeminent Le Fanu scholar, suggests that Le Fanu's prolific output in the 1860s, particularly in the pages of the Dublin University magazine, in which he serialized at least 8 novels between 1861 and 1869, was down to financial need. He was just producing that material because he needed the money. But also because as a contributing editor to the Dublin University magazine, he realized that he could fill the pages of his magazine with his own work for free, excluding the cost of his own labor, of course, and could then sell on the rights of those novels afterwards. And it's this repetition, McCormick indicates, that condemns a great part of Le Fanu's oeuvre to oblivion. I'm quoting McCormick here: much of Le Fanu's later fiction is repetitive, and though this feature may be obsessive rather than mechanical, a full study of his novels and stories cannot be justified. But what if there's a method to the madness, or more specifically, a greater significance to the repetition than simply cash? Andrew Piper has convincingly argued that the culture of the copy that really begins to develop in the Romantic period, so earlier in the 19th century, wasn't just about repetition, but the fostering of a new idea of creativity. The copy wasn't just, as Piper writes, quote, a vertiginous process of hollowing out some more authentic essence, but was also the initiation of a new form of creativity, one that depended on a fundamental collectivity, on the cultivation of a new combinatory spirit. And I think applying this to Le Fanu encourages a reading of all of his works as a system or a network, as a collective, which is not only interlinked by the texts themselves speaking to each other through different versions of themselves, but also interpolated into the various bibliographic environments in which they circulated from the 19th century to today. And here I'm thinking particularly of intertextual references, right? Allusions to Le Fanu's works in other works, such as Joyce's repeated allusions to various Le Fanu short stories and novels, including The House by the Churchyard in Finnegan's Wake, and afterlives such as the YouTube Carmilla series with which I began this talk. I think attending to literary connections would, to adopt Piper's phrasing, draw attention to individual Le Fanu works, not as, quote, timeless, static, and ultimately enclosed literary objects, but instead as one cog in a larger machine of material distributedness and connectivity. And what this would involve, and I'm drawing to a close here, in the first instance at least, is a much more thorough and detailed attention to his works as a whole. And I think the application of novel analytical methods to trace that network of which Piper speaks. Now, I don't, unfortunately, have the time or the expertise really to flesh this out here or really to do that work, but suffice it to say, I'm advocating renewed attention to Le Fanu and not just to that small handful of texts for which he's remembered today. There's been some really excellent research in recent years that has done just this, including exciting doctoral work by Sean O'Rourke and Morin Gallinet. But there's room for so much more, particularly if we think of the possibilities afforded by digital humanities and digital humanities methods that would allow us relatively easily to quantify and visualize this distributedness and connectivity. And perhaps in the process, as Colleen rather pessimistically suggests, we'll discover that Le Fanu is, quote, even less appealing to cultural memory than he currently is. But I think if the interest and the energy of the group gathered here are anything to go by, that won't be the case. Thank you very much.